I was born and raised in Johnson City, Tennessee, up in East Tennessee, and went to high school there, even went to college at East Tennessee State. Matter of fact, where we lived was only 2 blocks away from the East Tennessee State campus, so it wasn't like I went a long way to go off to college, but graduated from East Tennessee State and journalism degree, and Johnson City is my home.
When you were growing up, going through your high school years, college years, were there any sports figures or celebrities that you sort of idolized and kind of looked up to a little bit?
Well, I'd be lying if I said that there weren't. There were, but I grew out of all that idolatry. I don't look at sports figures in that way, and certainly didn't do it past the time I was probably 15, 16 years old. But Mickey Mantle was my hero growing up, and when I learned what Mickey Mantle was all about off the field, he shouldn't have been a role model or a hero, but certainly liked the way he played baseball, and so I'd have to say he was one of them. But I enjoyed sports just for the competition and the good games and things like that, so I really didn't live and breathe with any one particular game or didn't want one team to win. I just wasn't like that, and when I got into journalism, that's the way it's supposed to be. When you're writing columns, I didn't plan it that way, but that's the way it turned out.
Did you go into college wanting to write about sports?
Did not have a clue. I didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up. Matter of fact, I had serious doubts about whether I would ever grow up. And so I bounced around, changed majors several times. This was in 1966, I was starting my senior year, still didn't know what I wanted to do, and the Vietnam War was in full swing then, and the draft status back then was determined by percentage that they had in their draft boards, and so it wasn't a number or anything like that. So I got a letter to come take a physical, and anybody that had a heartbeat back then could pass the physical. So instead of being drafted, I joined the Air Force for 4 years, and stayed in the Air Force 4 years, including a tour of Vietnam. And after I got out, I came back. When I left, East Tennessee State didn't have a journalism department. When I came back, they had a journalism department, communications department, and things like that. A friend of mine who went off into the Air Force same time I did, he started taking some journalism classes, told me he thought I would like those, started taking them, and about the same time I had to get a part-time job because the GI Bill wasn't paying enough for me to go to school. And got a job at the paper in Johnson City, working nights, helping putting out the morning sports section. So that is how I got into sports and sports writing. Didn't grow up wanting to be one, didn't even know what one did, really. And I just fell into it, and it came natural to me. And God will put you in the places He wants you to succeed. I've always been a big believer of that. And He waited long enough to prove it to me, but He certainly put me in the right place, and it's been I've been in the business 40 years now, and it's been a great profession. I wouldn't want to do anything else.
So you would say that you reacted pretty well from just being thrown into the profession, right?
Yeah, I did. I caught on easy, and matter of fact, at the Johnson City paper, it was still hot metal type. I know a lot of people don't even know what that was now. And you had to read the proofs upside down and backwards on metal plates that they put together. And so if it wasn't for the people back in the press room teaching me how to do that, because we had 2 people who were in front of me quit and take other jobs, and so I was the only one there, and I hadn't even written a headline in my life. So you talk about trial under fire, that's exactly what I did it. But I learned it, and I worked a ton of hours, and I was taking 20 hours that quarter, my final quarter, and working probably 40 or 60 hours at the paper. So I wouldn't recommend that for everyone that gets into the business, but it certainly served me well.
Well, fast forward a bit. When did you start working in Nashville?
I came here in 1979, November 1979. I'd worked in Daytona Beach at the paper down there, and I got a call from a friend of mine that I knew. He was working at the Banner at the time, and Edgar Allen, who was a sports editor there after Fred Russell, had retired and left for Louisville to become the communications director for the media up there. So I came here, interviewed, and replaced him. And soon after I got here, I was named sports editor the Banner and also a columnist. Came here as a columnist and added sports editor, where I oversaw the sports department, and so that's how I got here, and the rest is history.
Do you recall one of your first jobs as being a writer in town in the Nashville area, as opposed to East Tennessee or Daytona?
Yeah, well, it was different. I didn't know anything about. I'd never worked in a two-newspaper town, and the Banner and the Tennessean were very competitive, especially in sports. And one was as far right politically as you could get. That was the Banner, and the Tennessean was about as far left politically as you could get. So we coexisted in the same building, 1100 Broadway, and it was pretty brutal competition there, especially with the the two sports departments going after each other. So I think the first really big story that I remember was the Vanderbilt steroid scandal that broke in the early 80s. Matter of fact, I had that story and went to see Coach McIntyre early that morning and told him. He didn't even know about it, and he brought Doc Crease, the strength and conditioning coach, up there, and I told him I wanted to talk to him. I was going with a late run story for later that afternoon, and he lawyered up real quick, and I was told that there wouldn't be any interviews for quite some time. And so I had to wait until the next day to run the story. And the Tennessean cobbled together some kind of story. They didn't know everything about it, but they knew enough to come out with a story. So that's how I got beat on that one. And that was kind of disappointing because I really had the story first, and but didn't get to because of extenuating circumstances there.
Mm-hmm. Now, since you started the conversation about the Banner and the Tennessean sort of competing, were there any other instances similar to that one, to where maybe one sports department reported something maybe a little construed or wrong, just trying to get the story out there?
Well, back then, you better have it right. It's not like today. Now you just throw a lot of stuff up on the wall and see what sticks in journalism, and I'm kind of disappointed that it's gotten to that point. And so I think the one that was, there were a couple of stories that come to mind. We were sure that the Tennessean could hack into our computer system and see what we were writing for the next day, and we would keep our stuff out of print until they went for the last time, and then if it wasn't in the Tennessean, we knew we had them beat. Well, I'm sure they thought the same thing. I thought we could get into their system. And there was a funny story. One prep writer at the Tennessean was getting beat quite regularly by our prep writer, C.B. Fletcher. And so C.B. would write his out. You had to write them out on paper with a manual typewriter and then send them up to the composing room the next morning. Well, he would write it on a typewriter, put it in his desk. Well, the guy across the hall, their prep writer, he would come over there after everybody from the Banner had left for the night, and he would go in his CB's desk, and he would see a story that CB was going to write. He'd take it back over to the Tennessean, he'd write it up for the Tennessean, and he was stealing stories. So CB finally caught on to that and put a fake story in his desk one night, and of course they bought the hook was in, and they went over there and they printed that story, and there was no truth to it whatsoever. But those are some of the times that it was brutal competition. I mean, it was you'd go to any means to beat the other paper, and they would too.
You just mentioned prep writing. Did you do high school sports before you did college sports, or how did you start off covering? What did you start off covering here?
Well, I covered a little bit of everything when I first started. Like I say, the first job, the part-time job in Johnson City, I was putting out the paper, so I didn't get out and cover very much. When I went to Daytona, I did a little bit of everything. Did desk work, covered some high school games, big high school games, mainly concentrated on Florida football, and the Tampa Bay Bucks started their program over there, so I spent a lot of Sundays covering them. So not much. I never had a high school beat, but I did cover. Matter of fact, the first story I covered at the Banner was a high school playoff game down in, I want to say, Tullahoma or Shelbyville, and I'd just come from Daytona Beach, and it was freezing cold, and I didn't even have a heavy jacket because you didn't need one in Daytona, and I didn't know if I was going to make it or not through that game. I was so cold.
So, what was the difference in like the colleges around this area, like Vanderbilt and MTSU, and in relation to Florida and FSU? And what was the difference in covering those two different schools in the different areas?
Yeah, there wasn't really much difference. Of course, Florida was in the SEC. Vanderbilt was too, although to a different degree. And so it wasn't. And Florida State was not very good at that time. Matter of fact, they had a coach down there, Dr. Darrell Mudra, had a PhD. He coached from the press box at Florida State. And Bobby Bowden replaced him, and the rest was history with Bobby Bowden coming in there and winning all the games he did. Bobby Bowden's one of the greatest gentlemen, one of the greatest coaches I've ever been around, and so that was a pleasure. And Doug Dickey, the former Tennessee coach and later athletic director, was the football coach at Florida, so he was the first one I covered at Florida.
Talk about how it's different when you started covering colleges then to what it's like covering, what it would be like covering them now.
Yeah.
There's a lot more, I guess, what the word that they like to use is pageantry, and there's a lot more, I feel like they think they're more superior than they are now. Obviously, it's a bigger media market now with all the recruiting and everything. And just talk about the differences between that time period and now. Today.
The college sports, especially football in the Southeast and basketball to some degree, has really blossomed. A lot of money is to be made in those sports, and colleges recognize it. The thing I don't like from a media standpoint is we used to have pretty much open access to the athletes, and by the time they graduated, you knew who they were, you knew their story, first name basis with them, and now that doesn't happen. Now they bring them in and they put them on a podium, and half the guys have never been in an interview session, and they're all stiff and they don't answer your questions. You can't get in-depth answers from them, and you don't get much time with them, and very rarely do you get one-on-one with a coach. These days they're also formatted, and I think that's taken some of the human element out of covering big-time college sports.
Yeah, I feel like the first person you always see onto the field is not a coach or a player, but it's a PR guy at the end of a game. And now I feel like dealing with them is just, it's another wrench in the system, I suppose.
It's a pain, yes.
Now we're talking about colleges. Let's just stay there. Talk about some of the best college games you covered or college events. You point out the steroid issue. That's a big story, especially at the time. That was before, the whole steroid age came up in baseball and now football, and it's growing to other sports. Talk about some of the best college sports stories that you may have covered.
Well, I covered national championship games, mythical national championship games. You didn't have a way to do it except try to match up the two top AP teams, and then you didn't do it because each conference had to go to a bowl game. So I had, once they got rid of that, I started covering the championship games, and there were some great games out there. Certainly the one that Vince Young played at Texas and beat Southern Cal. That was a great game. A lot of great games. College football is really exciting. It just gets better and better. The athletes get better. They're bigger, they're stronger, they're faster. The product is better. But I've been to a lot of great games. Covered Tennessee games, covered Vanderbilt some, and also I would go to Auburn, Alabama game. If Tennessee and Vanderbilt didn't have a big game, I'd go to Florida, Georgia game when it was, usually the winner of that won the conference or won that side of the conference after they split. So we had a lot of access to those games back then, and that was before newspapers started cutting back their travel budgets. And so, yeah, gosh, I don't know. I can't recall all of the ones that I covered. There were so many, and covered Final Fours in basketball. Covered over 20, 23, 25 Final Fours, and I was always had a friend that kind of ran that place, and my seat was right behind the television announcers at midcourt. Pretty good seat for the Final Four, and certainly there were a lot of good stories that came out of those Final Fours.